Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. We have an amazing show for you today. As you can see, Emily has returned for Sagar again. Great to see you, Emily.
Thanks for having me back.
Our pleasure. Of course, you did a phenomenal job yesterday. Lots of big news to get to. We have a great show for you. Max Alvarez and Marshall Koslov are here for the panel. We've got Will Jawando and Brianna Joy Gray to react to the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. And that, in fact, is where we want to start the day. After just 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned verdicts of guilty for Derek Chauvin in the killing of George Floyd. He had been charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. And I think part of what's really important to keep in mind here in terms of the context and what this means and what this doesn't mean is how close this was to going in another direction. And what I mean by that is if Darnella Frazier, a 17-year-old teenage girl, hadn't been there on the scene to film that horrific 10-minute video that shocked the conscience of the nation and the world, this could have very easily gone the way that these things, frankly, almost always go. And the way that you know that is that right there up on the screen, let's throw that back on the screen, is because of what the initial police report said. And I mean, they just flat out lied. They said that there was a medical incident. Two officers arrived and located the suspect, being George Floyd. He was ordered to step from his car after he got out. He physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. That bears no relationship to what actually happened. And that gives you some understanding of why it is so rare for police officers to actually be convicted when they do commit crimes. Chauvin is just the 7th on-duty cop to be convicted of murder since 2005 out of around 15,000 police killings in that time. Now, some of those police killings were certainly justified, and some of them certainly were not justified. So it took a video that shocked the entire world. It took a mass movement, the largest protest movement in all of history, to secure this one conviction. One more piece of context here of how incredibly rare this is. This is from the ACLU. This was the first time in Minnesota state history that a white police officer has been convicted for killing a black man. So a dramatic, historic event, something that everyone was tensely watching which way this would go. Ultimately, the defense tried to argue what this really turned on was, okay, was what Officer Chauvin did, was it reasonable? And did it actually cause the death of George Floyd? The defense tried to argue, oh yeah, it was reasonable. This is what police officers do. His own colleagues rebutted that particular defense. They also tried to argue because George Floyd had drugs in his system that was the real cause of death. The prosecution had a much simpler case, which was just look at the video. Just look at the video and ask yourself if this caused the death of George Floyd. And the answer to the jury with a very short deliberation was apparently pretty obvious.
Well, you said something I think I want to pick up on. You said that the video shocked the conscience of the nation. And I think the silver lining to all of that is this nation really has a conscience about what they saw. And that showed up, I think, in the response to the video. And the defense for Derek Chauvin, like the formal defense, is pretty much the only defense he has been able to find in the entire country, right? He hasn't had a lot of very strong defenders, and you won't find a lot of people defending what you see on that videotape. And to the extent that there is a silver lining, I see it in that, in that we were just sort of issued a very full-throated condemnation of what played out on that tape. And you know what, I think a couple of lawmakers spoke to this yesterday. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and the President of the United States, Joe Biden, and Vice President Kamala Harris addressed the verdict yesterday. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
George Floyd mattered. He was loved by his family and his friends. His death shocked the conscience of our community, our country, the whole world. He was loved by his family and friends. But that isn't why he mattered. He mattered because he was a human being. And there is no way we can turn away from that reality. The people who stopped and raised their voices on May 25th, 2020, were a bouquet of humanity, a phrase I stole from my friend Jerry Blackwell. A bouquet of humanity, old, young, men and women, black and white, a man from the neighborhood just walking to get a drink, a child going to buy a snack with her cousin, an off-duty firefighter on her way to a community garden, brave young women, teenagers, who press record on their cell phones.
So we can't leave this moment or look away thinking our work is done. We have to look at it, we have to look as we did for those 9 minutes and 29 seconds. We have to listen. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Those are George Floyd's last words. We can't let those words die with him.
Today, we feel a sigh of relief. Still, it cannot take away the pain. A measure of justice isn't the same as equal justice. This verdict brings us a step closer, and the fact is, we still have work to do. We still must reform the system.
What did you think of Biden's speech last night?
I thought it was good, and it reminds me of how comforting presidential words can be, when they're eloquent and articulate and serious, and also heartfelt, sincere. And so I think what he did was sort of pitch perfect in matching the tone of the country. Yeah,
I thought he always always looks a little out of it these days.
I can't disagree with that.
Aside, I thought the content of the speech was very effective. And like you said, the bar has been set so low in this country in terms of just having a president say the normal crap that you want to hear a president say. And I think that he pulls that off really well. And there was an interesting contrast to me between the language and the way that he talked about this in a very, to me, sort of like everyday type of way, versus Kamala's speech was to me, it was filled with sort of like jargon that would appeal to like an activist community, which is fine. But there was a very different kind of tone and approach that came from the two of them. I also think it's really noteworthy. I mean, look, Keith Ellison, who was a Bernie supporter from the jump, very progressive guy on the left of the party. Obama went to the mat to make sure he was not the DNC chair. Obama, who sort of famously is hands-off on politics, he really intervened to make sure it was his guy, Tom Perez, and not Keith Ellison, who ended up in charge of the DNC. Now he is the first Black statewide office holder in the state of Minnesota, and he's getting a lot of credit for how he prosecuted this case. This from someone on Twitter, Justin Miller, points out that there were big discrepancies between the DA's complaint against Chauvin and AG Keith Ellison's complaint against Chauvin. His complaint, much more effective. The DA was much more favorable to Chauvin and police kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt, using much less harsh language in the complaint itself. So Keith Ellison really handled this incredibly well, and I think has stepped up in the national spotlight in a very important and poignant way.
I think you make a really interesting point about the contrast between what President Biden said and what Vice President Harris said, in that Biden, there's something to be said for the way that, and we now have a contrast between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, for all the nonsense that the left and the center and the never Trump right made about Donald Trump, Donald Trump's inarticulateness or whatever, his unorthodox speaking style, for all of their complaints about that. Clearly there's something to be said for having a president that can soothe sort of tensions instead of exacerbating them in moments where I think the country sort of let out a sigh of relief when this verdict came out yesterday. And to have a president that soothes that instead of throwing gasoline on the fire, is there something to be said for how helpful that was?
I mean, it's really interesting. His speeches are like, could be written by any presidential. I mean, they're just like generic presidential speech.
Totally.
And yet, I actually think that that's exactly what the country kind of wants right now.
And like, it sounds so stupid, doesn't it?
Just give me the pablum. Give me the stuff that sounds like what I expect to hear right now. Don't shock me. Don't go out on a limb. Just like say the stuff that I expect to hear right now that lands, in a really normal way. And I think that he sort of is that it's one of the secrets to his success and his high favorability right now is that he doesn't actually adopt all the jargon and the language of activists. He doesn't certainly go in like Trump and try to like pour gasoline on any little fire that starts anywhere in the country. And so in that way, I think he was effective. But I do think that Keith Ellison deserves a lot of credit here. You know, to bring this back to the beginning, we have to keep in mind, even though this sparked the largest protest movement in history in terms of actions from Joe Biden, there's been nothing. In fact, he disbanded his police oversight commission quietly, even as this trial was going on, something that he had promised on the campaign trail he would do. He just quietly disbanded that. We're going to talk to Brianna later this show about how Democratic aides are leaking, that they feel like this verdict kind of lets them off the hook from having to do anything on police reform, which very counterintuitive. I mean, again, the fact that it takes the largest protest movement in history just to secure some basic measure of accountability on what was so clearly a shocking, horrific crime, it says something about the progress that still needs to be made in the country.
Well, I was going to say, and the point to make to those aides who are leaking is that, listen, it's about preventing it from ever getting to that point, not ensuring that justice is rendered when it does get to that point, because the system in this case did work. It doesn't in every case, but preventing us from getting to this point should be the aim going forward.
Yes, preventing us from getting to this point, and then, yes, that would be ideal. But if that doesn't happen, at least getting some measure of accountability. I mean, there's just a lot of systemic rethinking that needs to happen. And I want to say, the protest movement wasn't in vain. There have been a lot of changes at the state and the local level. But as of yet, nothing on the federal level. And if they feel like this let the pressure off of them, that is a very sad state of affairs. All right, I'm going to tell you what's on my radar. That's next.